Here are 37 questions about Employment Tribunal in the UK answered for you. At the end, I will show you how to get another 28-page document that talks you through exactly how to manage your employment issue. Number 1, how much does an employment tribunal cost? Well, the short answer is nothing. There was an employment tribunal fee for a short period of time, but it was found to be unconstitutional and it was gotten rid of in, I believe it was 2017. So there is no fee to take your employer to employment tribunal here in the UK. If you do want to pay for any kind of legal representation, legal support, you will pay that, but there is no fee for the court itself. What does an employment tribunal do? Well, the employment tribunal finds whether your employer acted illegally, and if so, if they need to compensate you for that illegal action. What happens at employment tribunal? Well, once you make a tribunal claim, the court will get in touch with you and your employer. Your employer will have the right to do a reply. It's called an ET3. And then the court will send out some instructions for the three of you, your employer, and the tribunal, to get in touch, and then you'll figure out what to do next. Typically, they schedule some dates, they figure out what the exact legal arguments are going to be, and then you both present your cases, and then they decide whether or not the employer acted illegally. If they do, then they'll decide whether or not you need to be paid any compensation, and they will determine how much that is. That's called the remedy. How often do employers settle a tribunal case? Very often. The latest data shows that 24% of cases that were lodged with the tribunal were successfully settled with ACAS conciliation, and then another 23% were withdrawn. Now, withdrawal might be that the person decided not to pursue the case, or it could also be because of a successful settlement using an outside solicitor or something like that. So, you're looking at about a third who probably settle. Can an employment tribunal refuse a claim? Technically, yes. So if you make a claim and you have nothing to substantiate it with, then it might get rejected at the first hearing, or it could be struck out because it has zero chance of success. About 9% of cases are struck out entirely. Who pays for the employment tribunal? Well, each side pays their own costs. So you would pay your costs, like for example, if you use a lawyer, and the other side will pay their costs. And often that's one of the main points of leverage that you have with your employer, because legal fees are very expensive, and so they often might want to settle rather than having to pay for lawyers to represent them in the tribunal. Do I need a solicitor for employment tribunal? No. About 32% of cases have no solicitor at all. Another 55% are represented by a solicitor. Some are represented by a trade union, and the rest are represented by lots of different kinds of people. You don't actually have to be a solicitor to represent someone in tribunal, and also you don't have to have any kind of representation. So about a third of people represent themselves, and those people are called litigants in person. How hard is it to win an employment tribunal? Let's look at the data. So of all the cases that went through tribunal in the last period, 24% successfully settled using ACAS, 23% were withdrawn, and then 8% were successful at hearing, and 5% were unsuccessful at hearing. So if you take out the cases that were withdrawn or settled, then you've got roughly about a 16% group who actually won and about a 10% group who lost. And then there's a bunch of other smaller numbers for different kinds of outcomes. So it's hard. It's not a straightforward thing at all to win at tribunal, but most cases don't go all the way through the entire process. They typically settle somewhere along the way. What happens if I lose the tribunal? This is a great question, because one of the things that an employer might do if you lodge a tribunal complaint against them is threaten you that if you do lose, they're going to come after you for what are called costs. And that's essentially saying, if you lose, we're going to ask the tribunal to make you pay all of our legal costs. And obviously that's really scary, and often people withdraw their claims because they don't want that risk. The thing is, that is only awarded in 6% of cases where the claimant loses and the employer actually then asks the tribunal to pay those costs. So typically, most people who lose an employment tribunal case, they just move on with their lives. In 6% of cases where the employer follows up on that threat and applies for costs, the tribunal will then actually ask the employee to pay the costs. And that's only in extreme circumstances. So that's the normal outcomes of what happens if you were to lose your case. Will I get compensation from Employment Tribunal? Well, that's typically what Employment Tribunal is for. They call them awards, compensation for something illegal that the employer has done. And the award depends on the type of claim or the type of illegal activity that the employer is found to have done. For example, the award for unfair dismissal will be different for an award for discrimination, and all of the awards will vary, typically based on what you earn, how long you were discriminated against, or how much you were not paid, all kinds of things like that. What is the average Employment Tribunal award? Well, the most common award in an Employment Tribunal is unfair dismissal. In the last period, there were 933 of those, and the average compensation was £13,541, and the median, which is the number right in the middle of all the compensations, was £7,650. I'm going to rattle through some quick answers for other types of awards. Race discrimination, the average is $27,000. Sex discrimination, the average is $24,000. Disability, the average is $26,000. Religious discrimination, the average is $19,000. Sexual orientation, the average is $32,000. And age discrimination, the average is $18,000. Now, there are other types of discrimination as well, like maternity and pregnancy, but they aren't listed in the official tables. What evidence do you need for Employment Tribunal? Well, the evidence does depend on the claim, but typically there are some basic things you always need. Any documentation about any kind of unpaid wages, things like that, your contract if you have it, often people don't because that's part of the problem, and something called contemporaneous notes is very, very important. And that's literally just writing down who said what, where they were, what time it was, what day it was, as soon as possible after it was said. Now that's so important because in the absence of any other kind of evidence, say smoking gun, a witness, anything like that, the court will take as evidence your account of what happened. And they'll put more weight on that evidence if you can show that you wrote it down as quickly as possible after it happened, because memory is unreliable. So evidence really depends on what's going on in your case, but always remember your contemporaneous notes. Can I use a secret recording at Employment Tribunal? People often do. We have a whole article about this on the VALA website, but typically there are some things to think about, but a lot of people are able to ask the Employment Tribunal to use a recording. Normally, the Employment Tribunal will use a transcript rather than the recording itself. What if my employer doesn't respond to the tribunal? Well, this is something that you can use to actually get the court to find in your favor. You can ask for what's called a Rule 21 judgment if the employer isn't engaging with the tribunal process. So if you have that situation, there are a few options that you can use to ask the tribunal to just go ahead and find for you and then award you any compensation and order the employer to actually pay it. Who gives evidence in the Employment Tribunal? Well, both sides will give their evidence, and they'll put all their evidence in something called the bundle. So once you've actually had a preliminary hearing, which most cases have, they'll set out a series of deadlines and dates for you and the other side to follow. And one of those things will be called a bundle. And that means that you're going to take every piece of evidence that you have, every email, every text message, all those different things, and you and the employer are going to send each other a list of what you've got. And then typically it's the employer's side who will then put all of that into one giant PDF document. And that's what all of you will work from when you're referring to any kind of documents. You'll say, if you look on page X of the bundle, you will find the email in question. Do I make a statement at Employment Tribunal? Typically, yes. So you don't have to walk through the whole thing on the stand most of the time. In England and Wales, you will submit a written witness statement beforehand. Everybody will read it, and then you will typically just answer questions about that witness statement once you're in the tribunal. In Scotland, it's more common to actually give the statement out loud in the tribunal. And finally, how do I make a claim to Employment Tribunal? Well, you can do this yourself. The form is called the ET1 form, and the most difficult section is called the Particulars of Claim. We have a template that can help you with that. Hit the plus sign and you'll find all the details. Did I answer enough questions? Let me know in the comments.